Ben Bradlee, revolutionary guardian of journalistic freedom. Ben Bradlee, a charismatic leader whose unyielding pursuit of accuracy and the truth, zealous protection of journalistic freedom, and nurturing of other reporters resulted in his shaping of history and leaving generations of reporters continuing his work. He was born to a Boston Brahmin family in 1921. At 15, he delivered newspapers, went on to Harvard, and joined the Navy.
He was a patriot, but he also believed, as I do, that there were many ways to serve your country.
In 1946, he was a reporter for the New Hampshire Sunday News, then a journalist for the Washington Post. He also covered JFK for Newsweek, where he boldly initiated its sale to the Post. He rose through the ranks at the Post, and in 1968 became executive editor. In 1991, he became vice president, his final position. Being in a position of responsibility in the Navy influenced his future as a leader.
As a 21-year-old, a 22-year-old having a position of real responsibility over a lot of people on a destroyer in the middle of the Pacific, I think that really showed him that he had the skills that it took, and I think once he got back from the war, he kind of knew he had it.
He went to work reporting for Newsweek and became known when covering JFK. He knew JFK well and wrote very intimate stories about him. These stories brought on his first competition. He had been on a plane with Kennedy.
Times political correspondent was standing on the ground, and he always remembered this moment of getting off the plane with Kennedy, and the Time guy looking right at him, and him looking right at the Time guy and thinking, I got you.
At the Post, Bradlee made a name for himself by covering several major events in the late 60s and early 70s. During the late 1960s, the anti-Vietnam War protests were picking up, and the nation was hopeful to get man on the moon. Women, however, were continuing to be treated like second-class citizens. Bradlee used his charisma to convince the publisher of the Washington Post into letting him create his more egalitarian vision, the style section.
All of those sections in newspapers were always the women's pages for and about women. And Ben changed it so that it would be features. It was really revolutionary.
Bradlee's cultural vision included broader representation in the newsroom for minorities. To do that, he changed his workforce by implementing a revolutionary hiring policy. During the early 1970s, the U.S. was going to pull out of Vietnam. A little before the Case-Church Amendment was signed, which pulled many troops out of Vietnam, top-secret documents were released by Daniel Ellsberg that the New York Times published, even though the government said they would harm the country.
Ben immediately printed the same papers, knowing that that there was a possibility that he could go to jail.
The Nixon administration sued the Times and Post to suppress the Pentagon Papers, claiming the publication would interfere with their ability to conduct foreign policy and increase the support for the enemy regime in North Vietnam, thus endangering American troops. While many defense experts, including Generals William DePuy and Paul Gorman, agreed with the administration and testified against the Post, Bradlee's insistence on printing the papers demonstrated his belief that we must be willing to pay a price for democratic ideals, like a free and adversarial press. In June of 1971, the Supreme Court proved him right when they dismissed the charges brought against them by the Nixon administration. Shortly after, in 1972, Richard Nixon was re-elected and was wildly popular. He had just been to China and the country was sailing high, until burglars were found breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. The Washington Post under Bradlee pursued the story.
That was the kind of story Ben absolutely loved. Bad doing in the government, and the Post was kind of leading the way in the coverage.
What Ben and the Post did in that era, in the early 70s in particular, was they held government accountable in a way that nobody really ever had before.
Under Bradlee's leadership, the facts about Watergate were reported in scores of articles, and without his leadership, Nixon probably wouldn't have resigned. Bradlee needed great reporters.
Early on with his hiring, he recruited some really terrific people, and he had a great eye for talent.
He dealt with opposition by using another form of his leadership, backing up and personally encouraging his reporters, like Ted Gupp, who was being challenged by many organizations, including the FBI and the New York Times.
And I always knew that he was there for me.
During Walter Mondale's 1984 presidential campaign, Mary Jordan interviewed Mondale's brother, and he said that he didn't think Mondale would win. Mary, to the anger of that campaign, included this in her story.
Mondale's presidential campaign went ballistic and called Ben Bradlee and said, "How dare you send this, kid, into our camp, and this is devastating." And Ben, I was nervous, young person. The campaign is on my head, and Ben said, "Fantastic." He just had your back.
As part of his leadership, Bradlee wrote letters of encouragement to his reporters, like Ted Gupp. And when he came from a meeting,
He would walk across the whole floor, big floor plan with hundreds of people. And his leadership, when he went by, he knew everybody by name. He would tap you on the shoulder. He'd say, "Hey, what's shaking, Jordan?" He just had this charisma and joy of life that was quite infectious.
The one thing you really wanted was Ben walking around when he walked around and congratulating you for whatever the hell you did.
Bradlee had a tremendous impact, not only on the Washington Post, but on the country, and he has an extremely widespread legacy, which includes defending the First Amendment, mentoring other journalists, and making the Post into one of the highest quality U.S. newspapers.
He was such a defender of the First Amendment and the freedom of the press, and an advocate for an aggressive press, an adversarial press. That that the press is there to hold public officials to account.
Leaves behind legions of just top-notch journalists who he worked with and he cultivated.
Certainly his legacy is part of who we are at the Post.
Bradlee's legacy has been of continuing importance.
I think every president is on notice that they're subject to the law.
If we look what happened in France with the Charlie Hebdo bombing, people are trying to suppress journalism and suppress a voice, and that's the most dangerous thing that can happen. And so I think that what Ben did was establish that the press was free in this country.
Bradlee's work established the press as a bulwark against the government keeping secrets that harm its citizens. Bradlee believed journalism needs to be asking questions like,
how do we know it's North Korea that's behind the hacking of Sony? The government says it is, but so what? Government said that WMDs were in Iraq. How do we know it? Where's the proof? Where's the evidence? Ben represented that kind of fierce independence. He didn't take people's words for anything.
Bradlee won his fight for freedom of the press, but that doesn't ensure it as his legacy. Freedom of information remains a constant tug of war between those championing democratic ideals, above all, and those charged with guarding our national security. Like in the days of Nixon, the Obama administration is currently attempting to keep controversial government documents secret in the name of national security. The ACLU is suing the government for the release of photos of torture at Abu Ghraib prison,
where the administration essentially says that terrorists across the world are going to dictate what Americans get to see relating to their own government. The argument that the Bush administration made and now the Obama administration is making is that these photographs could be used as propaganda, could complicate diplomatic relationships, and could provoke violence.
In June of 2013, Edward Snowden faced the same question when given access to classified documents revealing global government surveillance programs. Like Ellsberg before him, he chose to leak the documents. Without the faith in the adversarial press that Bradlee established, who knows if whistleblowers like Snowden would step forward with controversial information? Who will get to decide what the American people know about what their government does in their name? Will it be the terrorists, whose reprisals we fear, or will it be journalists and judges? Even if the administration is right and the photos released lead to terrorist actions, like Bradlee, we believe that the safety against government tyranny afforded by freedom of the press overall more than balances its costs. Ben Bradlee pursued accuracy and the truth. He ardently defended journalistic freedom, and his mentoring of other journalists resulted in his shaping of history and leaving generations of reporters to zealously guard our democracy with the protection of free press. Bradlee peacefully died at his Georgetown home in October 2014.